Hey, fellow A&P Nerds. Where are we? Right now, we are still, you and I, in the world of the human autonomic nervous system. And just as a little bit of mental gymnastics, a little bit of a reminder for us. So we're in the autonomic nervous system. Notice the red background, all motor all the time. The power of 2. 2s keep coming up over and over again in the ANS. 2, 2, 2. We see that all the time. How many divisions do we talk about? 2. Sympathetic, parasympathetic. There are actually 3, but in 223 we don't talk about that enteric, except to say that there is one. How many neurons does it take to go from the central nervous system to an ANS target cell? It takes 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. And I'm going to come back to this idea in a little bit. How many kinds of neurons do we have? 2. We have cholinergic neurons, which do what? Spit out acetylcholine. We have adrenergic neurons, which spit out what? Norepinephrine. In the world of receptors, we have 2 subtypes for each. So what I will do on our document is just scroll down a little bit, and this is just by way of warming up, everyone. You have plenty of good diagrams of this in your textbook. Let's say that this is the central nervous system. Here's a neuron. Here's a second neuron. And here, I like to draw smooth muscle cells. Why? Because they're easy to draw. Is an ANS target cell. The 2 neurons it takes to get there, we remember, are called the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. With this synapse right here where they meet being the ganglion. So the preganglionic neuron onto the postganglionic neuron, which onto the target. You might remember that all preganglionic neurons are cholinergic neurons, meaning they spit out acetylcholine. So the neurotransmitter released by this neuron right here onto the second neuron is our old friend acetylcholine. We know that. We remember that. So this is a cholinergic neuron because it spits out acetylcholine. On the dendrites of this postganglionic neuron, I'll use a color that's a little more different. How about yellow here? That's good. I have receptors that are nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Remember, bilingual receptors. They can speak acetylcholine or nicotine. Acetylcholine is the normal one. Then things change up a little bit here in the postganglionic neuron. If what we're discussing here is the parasympathetic division, if this was the parasympathetic, which is what we were talking about last time we met, Then the second neuron also spits acetylcholine onto the target cell. So the second neuron is also cholinergic. And the receptors on the target cell tend to be what type? This is mental gymnastics for us. Muscarinic cholinergic receptors on the target cell of the parasympathetic division. Right there. Muscarine being a drug that we normally do not have in our bodies. So listen to me say this. The preganglionic cholinergic parasympathetic neuron releases acetylcholine onto the nicotinic cholinergic receptors of the postganglionic parasympathetic neuron. The postganglionic parasympathetic neuron spits out acetylcholine onto the muscarinic cholinergic receptors of the target cell. This is the way that the parasympathetic division controls a target. If you look at the ANS table, not a lot of notes here, but you'll write on it. So in the top half of this, the first row, we are talking about the parasympathetic division. You can see that. The parasympathetic division, aka also known as what? The craniosacral division. Why? Because these neurons tend to originate from our cranial and sacral regions. So parasympathetic neurons, I can see exiting some of my cranial nerves down in the sacrum, craniosacral division. Craniosacral division. If I go back to the table, how many neurons does it take to go from the central nervous system to the target? 2. It's always 2. 2, 2, 2. The first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, tends to be long most of the time. It tends to be myelinated, has a myelin sheath, and it's a cholinergic neuron, which means this neuron, that's the spitting sound, spits acetylcholine onto this neuron. So I always like to draw this in on my table to show there's that first neuron actually spitting on the second one. The postganglionic neuron, which tends in the parasympathetic division to be short, no myelin sheath, it has nicotinic cholinergic receptors because all postganglionic neurons have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. It is also cholinergic and spits acetylcholine onto the target cell, which has muscarinic cholinergic receptors on it, be it cardiac muscle, smooth muscle cells, or a gland. This is the parasympathetic division. Now, 2 things that I'll point out here from the table: long first neuron, short second neuron, and where are the ganglia located? The 2 terms we use to describe parasympathetic ganglia are terminal and intramural. I'll say that again. Terminal or intramural ganglia. That second neuron is just a little tiny bitty thing. The first neuron is very long. The second neuron is very short. The ganglia are called terminal, meaning at the end, or intramural, which means in the wall. The ganglia are located at or near the target organ. So if it helps you to put that in English right on your table, well, by all means do so. At or near the target. So the first neuron is much longer than the second neuron. And the end result in the parasympathetic division is I have acetylcholine hit the target. Now let's look at the sympathetic division, also known as the what? Thoracolumbar division. Thoracolumbar. Why? Because these neurons exit where? The thoracic region of my spinal cord and lumbar region of my spinal cord. The first neuron here tends to be very short. The second one tends to be very long. The reverse of what we see in the parasympathetic division. Most of the ganglions are located right in the sympathetic chain. That's why we have it. A few of the ganglia are called prevertebral. Again, I'm going to say that again. A few of the ganglia are called prevertebral, sometimes collateral. Now, to be anatomically clear here with you, when I say prevertebral, I mean right in front of my vertebrae. So I'd have to dig down in there to find them. So you remember from lab about how far the sympathetic chain is away from the spinal cord? About that far, or even a little closer, right in front of the vertebral bodies, I would have prevertebral ganglia. Those prevertebral ganglia are right in front of the spinal cord. They're right in front of your spinal column. So prevertebral is very close, as close to the spinal cord as the sympathetic chain is. So the first neuron, very short. Second neuron is longer. Just like the parasympathetic division, the first neuron tends to have a myelin sheath most of the time. The second one does not. The first neuron is a cholinergic neuron. So I'm just going to keep my colors going here. So that means it spits acetylcholine onto the second neuron, which has nicotinic cholinergic receptors on its dendrites, because all postganglionic neurons have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. So this is the preganglionic neuron. This one over here is the post, if you can't see up above enough. But here's the big difference. This is where the difference comes in, right here. The second neuron in the sympathetic division tends to be adrenergic, which means it spits out norepinephrine, another neurotransmitter, onto the target cells. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say epinephrine. It's actually about 80% of the time, 80% of these neurons spit out norepinephrine, about 20% spit out just epinephrine, two different neurotransmitters. So the vast majority of the time it's norepinephrine that's being spit out. And you see two types of receptors on the sympathetic target cell. We'll get to that in just a minute, but let's take a look at a little of this anatomy. What I have drawn here is, again, a parasympathetic ANS pathway from the central nervous system to a target cell. A sympathetic pathway just changing colors so you see different neurons. The first neuron is short. The second neuron is long. The first neuron spits acetylcholine. Onto the nicotinic cholinergic receptors of the postganglionic neuron, because all pre's are cholinergic, all post are having nicotinic cholinergic receptors. But here's where the big difference comes in. This second neuron for the sympathetic division is adrenergic. It spits norepinephrine onto the target right here. A different neurotransmitter. So just like in last lecture we had two types of cholinergic receptors, guess what? We have two types of adrenergic receptors. 2, 2, 2, 2. Now, I'm going to lump them together, okay, this way. Greek letter, alpha. Greek letter, beta. I'm going to do the same thing over here again. The alpha beta 1 receptors and the alpha beta 2 receptors. This is the most common way you see them described. And I'm going to put a line between them. There are also a few more, like there's 3s and stuff like that. Some of you will study in pharmacy class, but this is our first time going out here. So, here's how this works. We have alpha and beta 1 receptors for norepinephrine. Remember, this is for norepinephrine. They tend to be excitatory usually. So if I had a target cell with alpha beta 1 receptors, well, let's change the color so it matches. How's that? With alpha beta 1 receptors, say right here, either one, and then norepinephrine hits this target, the target gets excited. Alpha beta 2 receptors are usually inhibitory. So if I have a target cell, smooth muscle again, with alpha beta 2 receptors on it, I want black here, alpha beta 2 receptors, and norepinephrine hits it, it tends to inhibit the target. So it depends on which grouping of receptors we have that we're talking about. I don't want to turn this into pharmacy class, but jot this down in your notes somewhere. This will come into play later. Beta 1 receptors are the ones we find on cardiac muscle. They tend to be on cardiac muscle. So when norepinephrine hits cardiac muscle becomes excited. It contracts. It's excitatory to cardiac muscle because on the surface of the cardiac muscle cells, you have beta 1 receptors. There's a little more variation here in the alpha and beta 2s. Some are found on various targets, but this is a good way to think of it first time out of the starting blocks. Two kinds of adrenergic receptors. So whether norepinephrine creates excitatory or inhibitory effects on the target depends on which grouping of receptors the target has. Remember, the neurotransmitters are not excitatory or inhibitory. It depends on the target, right? I'm going to repeat that because it's been a while. An individual neurotransmitter is not excitatory or inhibitory. It depends on who the target is. Does this make sense to everybody? I hope so.